Welcome to the Challenger series of Srijan Podcasts, where we invite some great minds to share the biggest challenge they have faced in their careers and how they solved it. Let us meet our guest for this episode. Let me introduce our guest for today, Darren Mitchell. Darren is a passionate individual with a desire to unleash the leadership potential of high performing sales leaders and their teams through focused leadership development, high performance coaching, workshop facilitation, mindset, and behavioral change. Over the last 20 years, he has built a successful career in corporate sales, sales management, people leadership, people development, and leadership coaching. He has worked closely with a number of senior executives from Telstra, Singtel, Optus, PwC, KPMG. There's a long list, I must say. He has a creative and challenging approach and an articulate and thought-provoking communication style that we'll see in a while, enabling sales leaders to fully unleash their leadership potential, creating empowering and positive transformational change for them as well as their team. However, now comes to the most interesting part of his introduction, the list of accomplishments that he has. Darren holds a Bachelor of Engineering, is a certified life coach, master practitioner of neuro linguistic programming, certified master practitioner of the Coaching Institute's Deep State Repatterning, certified master practitioner of hypnotherapy, certified trainer of neuro linguistic programming, extended desk accredited consultant and trainer, certified level 2 practitioner and profiler of Better Dynamics, and runs a podcast series called the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast. Well, I was out of breath.
Yeah, that is a long introduction.
Welcome, Darren. It's a pleasure to have you on Srijan Podcasts.
Thanks, Arijit. Appreciate the invitation, and it's great to have a conversation with you. And I've got to say, it's really funny when you hear other people talk about the introduction, then you sit back and you think, wow, that's really interesting. I'd really like to meet that person. Or is that really me?
I'm sure there will be a lot of people who would like to meet you.
It's pleasure to be here.
I was going through your latest podcast. I think the title was Perspective.
Yeah.
You were talking about taking a wider view of the problem so that it doesn't look like a difficult challenge anymore. If I got the crux right towards and even for the listener, I think you should go on his blog, go through that Perspective podcast, that particular episode. I think that was really fantastic, the way he was breaking down on how to look at problems. However, for this particular session, let's take a closer view to a challenge. And to my favorite question, if you have to pick one really complex problem that you have encountered and solved in your professional career as a sales coach or sales executive, up to you, what would that be?
It's a really good question. And look, to be honest, since you and I have been talking, for the last couple of weeks, and you and I have been connected on LinkedIn for a while, so it's a question that I've been sort of contemplating a lot. And there's been a lot of problems and a lot of challenges I've had to solve, not only as an individual contributor, as a card-carrying, bag-carrying salesperson, but also as a sales leader. And I thought the best approach to take, and I was reflecting on this, it's not so much a technical problem or a strategy problem in the sales realm. What came to the surface for me as I was reflecting on this is the challenge of your own career and making a transition from one role to the next. And in my case, making a transition from an individual selling role to a sales leadership role. Now, many people might think, well, that's a really thing. You've been a successful salesperson, so why wouldn't you just transition really easily into a sales leadership role? But when you think about it, the skill set and the competencies and what's required of you are completely different. What's common, though, is you've still got customers and you still have to hit targets, but the way you go about that is completely different. Now, the reason I call that the biggest challenge for me, it's the career, right? And what I see now, and this is why I do what I do, is that there are so many sales leaders out there who have been thrust into the position of sales leadership because they've been a fantastic individual contributor. They've been the number one salesperson in the team, And the company has looked at them and said, wow, Arijit, you are such an awesome account manager. You're a business development manager who has completely and consistently hit and overachieved your targets every single year. We want to be able to leverage you. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to now anoint you as the sales leader of this organization. Now, we're not going to give you any support, but what we want you to do is we're going to give you the title. We're going to give you the responsibility. We're going to give you probably an extra 10 to 15 hours per week of responsibility that you have to now find. But we want you to teach your team how you became successful. And this is where the challenge is. The vast majority of salespeople don't have the skill set to make that transition an easy one, because all of a sudden you've gone from a position where you are now responsible for delivering a target yourself. You are the hunter, to now have to go into a position where you're now looking after maybe 5, 10, 15, depending on the size of your sales team, of those type of people, and it's no longer about you. Now, for me, that was a real challenge, because all of a sudden I thought, I don't know what it is I don't know. But here's the thing, even though previous to that, I'd spent 2 years trying to build a sales leadership philosophy so that I was prepared for when that opportunity presented itself. But even with that, I wasn't prepared, because there's nothing like being thrust into, I guess, the fire and trying to work out what's what and who's who. And I always say there are as many people that have been thrown to the wolves or thrown in the deep end. You got to learn how to swim very, very quickly. But and that's why it's the biggest challenge, because most people don't get the support, don't have the transition plan, don't identify the key skill sets or the key competencies that are required to make that transition a successful one. So that was the biggest challenge for me.
Very interesting topic that you picked up. Did you write a case study about it, or create a podcast episode around this thing before?
Yes, I've done. I've done a lot of podcasts, and there's a number of episodes that I talk about this. The biggest, I guess, lesson out of it, and sometimes you don't know it's a real challenge until you're going through it and you're working out what's not working. The biggest challenge for me is I made the transition. I thought I knew what I was doing. And the mistake I made, and this is why it's a problem, this is why it nearly burnt me, was that I thought the way to build respect and trust with my team was to solve all of their problems. So what I do talk about with sales teams, and certainly sales leaders, especially new sales leaders, is to avoid at all costs creating an environment where there's codependency. And codependency I define as my sales team in the first 90 days, my sales team were dependent on me to be there to solve their problems. I was also there in the first 90 days, dependent on my sales team to come to me with problems so I could solve them, thinking that when I did that, I would actually be able to build respect and build trust. The problem was, all I was doing was building and cementing a fabric or a framework or a culture where they were expecting me to solve all the problems and do everything for them. So what they did, they tested me every single day. So I had people coming to me with any amount of problems. It could be a really simple problem. So I can't get through to the CIO of this organization. Can you help use your positional power, your sales leadership gravitas, to actually make a phone call, and hopefully they'll listen to you because they're not listening to me? Yeah, no worries. I'll do that. So I did it. Great. Opened the door. Fantastic. There'll be strategies that account managers weren't sure as to how to put a strategy together. So they came to me and said, can you help me with a strategy? So I would do, instead of asking them questions, I would get on the whiteboard and start building a strategy for them and doing it for them, which wasn't helping them. It was actually hindering their development, until I found, and I don't know how I came to do this, but I had a mentor that sort of came into my life about 3/4 of the way into the first 90 days of my sales leadership career, who basically asked me what I was doing, and I was explaining it to him. He said, mate, that is a recipe for disaster. What you're going to do is you're going to burn out, but in the process, you're going to burn out your team, because you're going to have a team who is completely reliant on you to be there all the time. You need to start to let go, and you need to start to think about some of the skill sets to put in place that will enable them to think for themselves. So we started to then talk about the power of independent thinking. So my process then from probably the 85-day mark beyond was to try and transition from an environment of codependency where they were relying on me to now independent thinking. And this is where it gets interesting because it's not complicated. It was a simple thing, like if an account manager had to come to me with a problem, instead of giving them as the first response the answer, and let's be honest, it's really easy to give an answer to somebody if you know what the answer is. That doesn't help them. I had to learn to ask a question. Sometimes I had to learn to create space and let them think about it first, and hopefully they will come up with an answer themselves. But I started asking questions and I started conditioning them to start thinking for themselves and thinking about the problem from different perspectives. And this is where the perspective sort of podcast comes into it, in terms of disassociating yourself from the problem and looking at it from multiple different perspectives and asking yourself some questions, maybe coming up with some solutions first, then we can have a conversation. So my challenge from that perspective was to have the discipline and the courage to not give the answer, to actually bite my tongue, and in some cases create a space where my account managers were really uncomfortable because they were hoping that I would have the answer, but that wasn't helping them. So over a period of the next 90 days plus, we started to change the relationship. And what was really intriguing about that is the problems became bigger, but the quality of the conversations around those problems became better. And instead of the account managers coming to me with all these little incidental problems, the problems now became bigger. But the process I'd actually started to go through was they were actually starting to think for themselves first. And so we had a better conversation, and in many cases came up with a much better solution compared to if I had just given them the solution, I might have been giving them the wrong one. So it was one of the biggest lessons that I've ever learned. And I'm so glad I learned it. I'm so glad I went through that challenge, because now when I work with sales leaders who are relatively new or have found themselves in an environment or have built a culture where they are at the center point of that culture, it's not doing their team any good at all. And one of the things I challenge most, if not all, of sales leaders I come into contact with is I challenge them to create an environment where their role becomes redundant. Now, when people hear that word, what do you think most people are thinking? Arijit, as a sales leader, I want you to get to a point where you are redundant. How do you think most people are going to think?
You're taking away my job.
Taking away my job, right? And so most sales leaders, therefore, will be quite protective of their role, of their team, and they want to keep good people with them to make them look good. No, the whole purpose is to make your team so good that they're actually better than you, to the point where you're no longer needed within that team because somebody else has come up and you've identified them as a successor. They've taken over, which means you're now released to go and do other good work in another part of the business, or in some cases in another business completely. So this is why I consider this to be one of the biggest challenges. And even in 2022, there are so many sales leaders who are simply thrust into the position of sales leadership because they've been a high potential, high performing person, and they're not given the blueprint. They're not given the transition plan. They're not given the support to make that transition from an individual to now leader of individuals. And it's a mistake that I see over and over and over again. And that's why people like me exist, to help them through that.
I think this was a very relatable story. And, sometimes there is a blind spot with the sales managers, or even I can relate the same story to like technical side of things as well. I've been a technical architect, and I've seen this same thing happen in terms of working with developers as well. There's a balance that need to be struck between leading by example and allowing that independent thinking.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you get more into leading by example, actually that turns into spoon feeding and making the teams dependent. Ultimately, you become such a node who is either under constant pressure, or you are not able to see your team grow the way you would want to, and you would not even understand what exactly is going wrong.
Yeah.
And in the end, sometimes you start blaming people that the developer or the sales guy is not that good. They're not putting so much effort. They're not thinking the way I think, which is perhaps digressing from the actual problem, which could actually be you. And getting all getting a little vague over solving that problem. So I think this was a very good example for that. And the way you presented it, I'm sure there will be many people who can relate and identify that blind spot for themselves.
It's a great comment, because we all have blind spots, all of us, right? And I talk in strengths, but I don't talk in weaknesses. I talk in blind spots or things that are less familiar, but we all have them. One of the key things that we as leaders need to think more about is being okay to have blind spots, being okay to not know stuff. Don't have to pretend to know things, but being okay to get things wrong as well. And as I made that transition from a codependent to more independent environment within my sales team, I knew that I had to grow and stretch and make mistakes and, challenge the status quo and all the other cliches you want to throw out. But it meant that there was no such thing as perfection. But I knew everything I did wasn't necessarily going to be perfect, but I was making progress. And so if you're leading by example and your sales team can see you trying things, implementing things, making mistakes, falling over, chipping a tooth, getting a bloody nose, bloody knee, whatever the case might be, but then getting up and continuing to move forward, brushing yourself off, and then making progress in a positive direction, then that's also a great example, because I always say that the team is and always will be a reflection of the leader. Now, when I look back, what I created in the first 90 days, I was dependent on being told what to do from my senior leaders, right? Because I had an example of them being told what to do by their senior leaders. So, of course, that just cascaded down. And so it was a massive reflection. All of a sudden, when we become more independent, not only did my team start to question me, I started to question them more. But as a leader leading upwards, I started to question and challenge my senior leaders in a respectful way. But I actually found my voice, and I found a level of courage that perhaps I didn't have up until that point, to say, you know what, I actually deserve to be here. I belong here. I'm going to work my butt off to be successful here, but I'm not going to focus on getting it right. What I'm going to focus on is making progress. And more today, there's more organizations that, thankfully, even though the scoreboard's there, and I know that you're in an organization that is driven by revenue and sales, and there's a scoreboard that says, have we been successful this month or not? And that's the end result, and we get that. But then focusing on what are the behaviors, what are the activities, what are the things we have to do in the month, in the week, during the day to make progress towards that outcome. We don't make that outcome the be all and end all. And that's where a lot of people fall short, is they focus all their time on the outcome and not necessarily on the activities that will drive towards the outcome. And that's one thing I learned very early on. And it's something that I continue to work with teams on to help them, create a much better, much more progressive environment that's inclusive, that people want to hang around and stay around.
But I must say it was a beautiful story. And it has actually given me some food for thought as well. While you were speaking, I could think of a few scenarios where I'm actually encountering it even right now in my teams, sometimes with myself as well. So good point to introspect. And perhaps I should call you again as a guest on this series to hear another one like this.
Oh, good. Happy to.
It has been wonderful to have you as a guest on Srijan Podcasts. Wish you a great day. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Arijit. Appreciate the opportunity, mate. Good to talk to you.
Hope you enjoyed this episode. For more such podcasts, please visit our website